Hello Year 11, this is now lesson 4 in the unit B2.5 response and regulation. So far in this unit we've had a look at how your nervous system helps your body to respond to changes in your environment. This lesson today now we're going to be moving on more to the regulation part of this unit and thinking about how we keep conditions inside our bodies at the correct levels. This lesson will be split into two sections. In this first section, our objectives are to look at defining the term homeostasis and then being able to describe how hormones within the body work. A short task now for you to complete in your booklets. If we can turn to page 18 and put today's date at the top, we're going to now find out what we mean by the term homeostasis. So using the code that you can see on page 18, I would like you to work out what the exemplary definition is for homeostasis, please. So pause the video and make sure that you've completed this task. Okay, so what you should have had for this is that homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal environment despite changes in the surroundings. So it's really important in our bodies that we keep certain conditions at the correct level. If they stray too far above or below where they should be, it can have devastating consequences in the body and can even be fatal. On page 19, you have a newspaper article and a table which I would like you to read, and using that work out what the three substances or conditions that your body are trying to maintain at a constant level by homeostasis. So by reading the newspaper article and looking at the table, you should be able to identify three things that the human body tries to maintain at a constant level. Pause the video and make a note of the three things on page 18, please. Okay, so from reading the article, you should have identified that we need to keep our water levels at the correct level. We need to carefully monitor blood glucose levels, and finally our temperature. So it's water, glucose or sugar levels, and our temperature that need to be maintained at a constant level by homeostasis. So why is homeostasis so important? Animals need to regulate conditions inside their bodies to keep them constant and protect from harmful effects that can occur if those levels go out of control. In the newspaper article that you've just read, obviously we've got an example there of someone who has consumed too much water. Because she'd taken ecstasy, her body wasn't getting rid of the water, and in that case it was fatal. So we need to make sure that we're keeping our water levels, our blood sugar levels, our temperature within certain limits, otherwise it can have very harmful effects on the body. So your metabolism operates only within a narrow range of temperature. pH is also important and obviously requires the appropriate nutrients like glucose and water. Now, some of these things are controlled by chemicals in the body called hormones. So many processes within the body are coordinated by hormones. These are secreted or released by glands within the body, and then they will travel around the body in your blood to their target organ. So with the examples that we've just talked about, your blood glucose level is controlled by hormones, as is your water level. We'll talk about what happens with temperature in the next lesson. So the rest of this lesson now we're thinking about hormonal control. There are other processes in the body that are coordinated by hormones as well. Another good example of that would be your menstrual cycle in females, where there's 4 different hormones involved controlling that monthly cycle and the release of the egg that occurs alongside it. So when we're thinking about hormones, there's various different areas in your body where they're produced by glands. If you can now turn to page 20 in the booklet, we've got the information you can see there on the screen written at the top of the page. And then we've got a picture of a human body with various different glands labelled. And then down at the bottom, you have some labels that will be going into those boxes. So what I'm going to do now is to show you this diagram with the labels in the correct place for 30 seconds. After the diagram has disappeared from the screen, I want you to have a go at putting these labels into the correct boxes on page 20. Okay, hopefully you've been able to remember what each of these labels is pointing to. So pause the video at this point now and label the boxes on page 20. Right, we'll just go back now and check your answers. So at the top, the label should be the brain. And as you can see there, in the base of the brain, we've got the pituitary gland, which produces many different hormones. Okay, some examples of hormones that the pituitary gland would be producing would be FSH and LH, so follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. You don't need to know about these, but these are some of the hormones that are involved with the menstrual cycle. We've then got in the neck the thyroid gland that controls activity and heat within the body. The thyroid produces the hormone thyroxine. We've then got the adrenal glands, so these would be situated at the top of the kidneys, and the adrenal glands produce adrenaline, which will enable your fight or flight mechanism. You can see then obviously we've got the kidneys labelled. Pancreas, which you looked at in year 10 when we were talking about digestion, because part of the role of the pancreas is to produce enzymes for digestion, but the pancreas is also involved in homeostasis by producing the hormones insulin and glucagon, which we're going to look at later on in this lesson. And insulin and glucagon are concerned with the regulation of your blood glucose levels. We've then got the glands that are involved in the production of gametes, so the ovaries in females and the testes in males, as well as producing the sex cells. These are also glands, so they're producing hormones. So in females, the ovaries will be producing the hormone estrogen, and also the hormone progesterone. And in males, the testes will be producing the male sex hormone, which is called testosterone. So these hormones are involved in causing changes that occur during puberty, and in females, they are also involved in the regulation and control of the menstrual cycle. So if you can make sure you've got these labels now correctly written in onto this diagram on page 20, please. For the rest of this lesson now, we're going to concentrate on one level of control in particular, which is going to be looking at how we control your blood sugar levels. As part of that, we're going to have a look at diabetes, and in particular looking at the differences between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, and also then explaining how we would test to identify if someone may have diabetes. So for this, we're looking now at page 21 in the booklets. So as you know from work that we completed in year 10, when you digest food, in particular carbohydrates, you release sugar. So when you break down a large molecule of starch using the enzyme amylase, you will produce sugar or glucose. Obviously, glucose is really important within the body because we use it then for respiration, which is how we release energy, keeping our cells alive. However, it's really important that we maintain our blood sugar levels at the correct level. If they go too high, we would refer to that as hyperglycemia. So hyper would be too high. Glycemia is referring to the glucose, to the sugar. Or if they go too low, we would refer to that as hypoglycemia. And it can be very dangerous in the body if blood sugar levels go too high or too low. So as you can see on the screen there, the control of blood glucose level involves the hormone insulin. However, there is another hormone involved as well. In the syllabus, it particularly mentions insulin and what happens when the blood glucose level goes too high. However, we're also going to have a look at what happens in the opposite direction. So when the blood sugar levels go too low, so there's actually two hormones involved in control of blood sugar levels. So it's insulin and glucagon. So you could add that on to page 21 in the booklets. So why is it so important that we control our blood sugar levels? As I mentioned just now, glucose is obviously vital in your bodies for respiration. So it's used in respiration in your cells to release energy to allow your body to function. So it's really important as well that we have the correct amount of glucose in the blood in relation to the sort of water levels as well. So if there was too much glucose in the blood, the concentration between the sugar and the water in your blood would be incorrect, and that would cause water to leave your cells by osmosis, which we learned about in year 10. So if you remember, with osmosis, water moves from where there is a higher water concentration to where there is a lower water concentration. So if there's too much glucose in your blood, that means there's too little water, and water would leave the cells by osmosis. Also, obviously, if you've got too little glucose in your blood, there wouldn't be enough for you to be able to carry out respiration. This second bullet point is actually missing from your booklet. So if you can now make sure you write that one in, please. So you've got the bullet point that says too much and water would leave cells by osmosis, but you're missing the bullet point that says too little and there would not be enough for respiration. So if you can add that in now, please. Okay, so we're now going to think about what happens in the body if we have too much glucose or too little glucose. So if there is too much glucose within our blood, there are receptors. As we've discussed when we're talking about the nervous system, receptors are able to react to a stimulus. So in this case, they would be sensing that the levels of glucose in the blood are too high. Those receptors then will send nerve impulses to your pancreas, and the pancreas will respond to that. So the pancreas in this case is the effector. Your pancreas will respond to that by releasing the hormone insulin. Now, you've probably heard of insulin before. It's something that people are usually quite familiar with because of its role in the treatment of diabetes. So when the pancreas releases insulin, what that causes, okay, so the response that happens then is your liver will start to convert that excess glucose into another chemical called glycogen. So that is then stored within the liver. so that in the future, if blood glucose levels go too low, the opposite can occur and the glycogen can be turned back into glucose, so you've got a store then of glucose if you need it. So once the insulin has triggered that conversion of glucose into glycogen, obviously your glucose levels will drop back to normal levels. That will be detected by the receptors and insulin then will no longer be produced. So obviously this would happen after you've had a meal. Once you've digested your food, the glucose goes into the bloodstream, that's picked up by the receptors, and your body will release insulin to bring those glucose levels back to normal. So at the bottom of page 21, we've got two diagrams here which are showing you what is happening in the body in response to either low blood glucose or high blood glucose. So if we have a look at the first diagram, so we've talked about high blood glucose levels. So you can see here, high blood glucose levels, information goes to the pancreas. Insulin is released by cells in the pancreas. Then the glucose is taken from the blood, either to be used by cells for respiration or stored in the liver as glycogen, and then you go back down to normal blood glucose levels. In the opposite situation, if we have low blood glucose, again that is recognised by the pancreas. However, in this case, a different hormone is released, which is called glucagon, and that will cause the liver to release glucose into the blood. So that glycogen, which was stored by the insulin, is now releasing more glucose back into the blood. You can see that a bit more clearly in this second diagram. I think this second diagram gives you a bit more a clear picture of what's happening. So if we start at the top, high blood sugar promotes insulin release from the pancreas. Follow the red arrows. So insulin does two things. It stimulates cells to take in glucose. Obviously they'll use that for respiration, but it also then stimulates the liver to change the glucose into glycogen and store it. And both of those things then will lower the blood sugar levels. If you have the opposite, so low blood sugar, so this may be when you've been asleep for a long time, you haven't taken in any food, when you haven't eaten for a period, or you've done some exercise and you've used up quite a lot of the glucose within your body, you may have then low blood sugar. So low blood sugar promotes the release of the second hormone, which is called glucagon. Again, glucagon is made in the pancreas. So glucagon stimulates then the liver to break down the glycogen into glucose, which is then released into the blood, raising the blood sugar level. Okay, so high blood sugar, insulin is released from the pancreas. Insulin stimulates the liver to convert glucose into glycogen. Low blood sugar, we've got the opposite. The pancreas releases glucagon, which stimulates the liver to turn the glycogen back into glucose and raise up the blood sugar level. So what I would like you to do now on the next page in your booklet, page 22, using these two diagrams, in particular this one, I would like you to draw a flowchart of what happens when glucose levels are too high and a flowchart of what happens when glucose levels are too low. So pause the video and write a flowchart, please. Okay, so if we just check that you've got the correct information now for these flowcharts. So for the first one, when glucose levels are too high, I would probably start with receptors. So receptors in the blood. detect high levels of glucose. It's a flow chart, so we need to put an arrow between each of the statements. The pancreas releases insulin. Then insulin stimulates the liver to convert glucose into glycogen. And store it. And then finally blood sugar level falls. So if we look at the second flowchart then, so when blood glucose levels are too low, so I'm just going to rub out certain words and change them slightly. So when receptors in the blood detect low levels of glucose, the pancreas releases glucagon. I will need to remove that one anyway, so that's fine. So glucagon stimulates the liver to convert glycogen. If you get asked a question on this part of the unit, please be careful with your spelling, because glucagon, glycogen and glucose obviously are very similar spellings. So glucagon stimulates the liver to convert glycogen into glucose and release it into the bloodstream. So blood sugar level then rises. Okay, so if we now move on, we're going to have a look at page 23, and we're going to be just having a think about what happens if the body is not able to control those blood sugar levels properly. So if there is a problem with that process that we've just discussed, what the consequences of that would be. So looking at the screen there, we've got some famous people there on the screen, and what they have in common is that they all suffer from diabetes. There are about 177 million people worldwide that suffer from diabetes, so it is quite a common disease, and the numbers of people with diabetes are increasing, and they're expected to double by 2030. The highest number of sufferers of diabetes are in countries like China, the USA, Indonesia and Russia. So with diabetes, what happens is that the concentration of glucose in the blood is not controlled properly by the body. So people are not able to produce insulin, or they're not able to produce enough insulin to keep blood sugar levels under control, which will lead to the person then having a high level of blood glucose. So you've got this information at the top of page 23. So as I said, diabetes is a common disease where the person will end up with a high blood glucose level because they are not producing enough or any insulin. There's actually two types of diabetes, and we're going to have a look now at the difference between the two types. So we've got type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So you have this table on page 23, which you're going to need to fill in this information. So for type 1 diabetes, This is the one that will be usually identified when someone is quite young, so when they are children or teenagers, or sometimes with adults as well, but they tend to be under the age of 40. So this one is not linked to anything that the person has been doing with regards to their lifestyle. It can come about because an infection has occurred in the pancreas, which has damaged the pancreas and preventing the cells then from producing insulin. And it can also be a genetic link with type 1 diabetes. So what happens with type 1 diabetes is that the pancreas does not make enough insulin. So there's a fault within the pancreas, as we see, either a genetic fault or due to an infection, where the pancreas is not able then to make enough insulin. So it will lead to there being high levels of glucose in the blood. So to treat or control type 1 diabetes, the person will need to inject themselves with insulin every day for the rest of their lives to control that blood sugar levels. They should also obviously be careful with what they eat, that they're not eating too much sugar. So what the insulin does, so when they inject themselves with insulin, that will react exactly as insulin in the body usually does and change the excess glucose into glycogen to be taken up by the liver and other tissues. There's also a possibility that they could have a transplant of pancreatic tissue in the hope then that the body would then start to produce more insulin for itself. Type 2 diabetes, this is the one that we're actually seeing the levels rising quite rapidly because it is linked to obesity. So as levels of obesity are increasing, we're also seeing increasing levels of type 2 diabetes. So this is the one that is usually identified in adults, normally over the age of 40. And it is linked to a poor diet, so eating too much sugar for a long period of time, and obesity. And in this case, the body is no longer responding to its insulin. So with type 2 diabetes, the best way to treat this is to do more exercise, eat an appropriate diet, in particular making sure that you're not taking in too much sugar, too many carbohydrates, which will be digested into glucose. There are also some medicines that people with type 2 diabetes will take, but insulin is not often used for type 2 diabetes in the early stages. It would only usually be needed when other medicines no longer work to control the condition. Can you now pause the video and make sure that you've got all this information written down onto page 23. One method of identifying if someone may be suffering from diabetes is to test their urine. So there shouldn't be any sugar within the urine, but if there is too much sugar within the body, then we can start to see glucose within the urine. So I'm going to show you a video now, which will show you two different methods to test urine to identify if a person is diabetic. So in this video, we've got 3 different samples of urine. So this is urine A. So I'm putting that into a test tube. You can see that the test tubes are sitting within a water bath over a Bunsen burner. So this is now urine B. So we're trying to identify which of these people may be suffering from diabetes. So urine B is going into test tube B. And then finally we've got urine C. Which will go into test tube C. If you remember from previous experiments that we've done. To test for glucose, we use Benedict's solution. So Benedict's solution at the start of the experiment will be blue. So I'm going to add in some Benedict's solution into each of the test tubes. And then we would need to heat that up strongly using the Bunsen burner. It takes a few minutes then to get results. So I've moved the video on a few minutes so that we've now got a set of results. So as you can see, person A, we've got a very dark brick red colour. Person B is still blue. And person C, we've got a lighter brick red colour. So this would suggest that person A had quite a large concentration of glucose within their urine. Person B, there was no glucose present, and person C had glucose there, but it was in a lower concentration than in person A. So you should remember that with Benedict's, it would go through sort of a green colour and then into these brick red colours, and the darker the colour, the higher the concentration of glucose. So this would suggest that possibly person A and C could potentially have diabetes. So the second way of testing urine would be to use something called a Cliny stick, which is what you can see in the pot. And on the back of the pot, it gives you a scale which would show you sort of how much glucose was in the urine. So if it remains blue, it means there's no glucose present. And then we've got that scale going through with the different concentrations. So I'm going to test each of the urine by just dipping the stick in, and then we would leave them for about 30 seconds to develop. So this is the information that tells you how much glucose will be present. So this is urine A, and as you can see, by matching up the colour of the stick with the results, we've got a high concentration there of glucose within that urine. B has remained blue, so that would suggest that there is no glucose in the urine. And C, if you remember from the Benedict's test, had a sort of smaller amount of glucose. So we would match that up with this one. Okay, so at the bottom of page 23, if you can now use the information on the board to describe how you could use Benedict's solution to determine if a person is diabetic. So that concludes all of the work that we're going to do on control of blood sugar. What I would like you to do now, on pages 24 to 27 in the booklet, there are some past exam paper questions on the control of blood sugar levels. I would like you to now have a go at these questions, and I will go through the answers in the start of the next video. Thank you.